The Oxford Dictionary describes contemporary as of the same age or style, and history as the study of past events or a story. When considering this topic, I had to reflect on the fact that I have been involved with wildlife law enforcement for some 33 years, in one way or another. And what worries me a little bit about that is that I believe a car that's over 30 years is classed as a vintage model. However, I was even more worried when I thought further and thought, what about the challenges and the changes that we've had to face in the last 30 years, in the last 3 decades? The Shad sheriffs of the 80s were very effective officers in this province, continually reminding fishermen of the coastal regulations in the nicest possible way. The terrestrial officers concentrated on being bokwachters, ambushing poachers in the hills and dales of the hinterland. Nice story, eh? Life was only complicated then by the odd poacher who ran away and one who did not pay his fine. Nationally, a few dedicated investigators realized that we couldn't go it alone, that we needed to talk to each other. Even then, we realized that the poachers had the better of us, across provincial boundaries. And so the Association of Wildlife Investigators was born. And twice a year, the clan would come together and swap notes and a lot of stories, some very funny and some very sad. The police at this stage recognized that South Africa was being targeted by wildlife criminals and established the Endangered Species Protection Unit. These first dedicated police officers were drawn from stock theft and other units and were based in Pretoria to serve the whole country. And they were the first in the country to have to deal with the Chinese sale and syndicates involving rhino horn back in the 80s. However, in the 90s, 2 noteworthy events took place. The Marine Living Resources Act came about, and the Shad sheriffs took on a fancy new professional title of Fishery Control Officer. And they all had to be retrained because the legislation was far more complicated than the old coastal regs. Just think about that point. We'll come back to that one shortly. Secondly, in the 90s, the birth of the new South Africa. The province, like all others, had to contend with new wildlife legislation. This meant that a lot of talking was involved in making headway. And we talked. And we talked some more. And in fact, we're still talking. And in KZN, as an example, some 20 years later, we still haven't yet got an amalgamated piece of legislation for the province. The number of times that I've had to explain to magistrates that the legislation of 1974, thanks Waldo for making it very clear in your previous presentation, actually still exists. It really does still work. It hasn't been replaced by anything. Yeah. However, during this time, Nico Snyman penned the Endangered Species Act to bring together all the provinces in dealing with our national CITES obligations from the same piece of legislation. Sadly, after green papers and white papers and many papers and a few forests that were felled, there was so much paper being used up here, that didn't see the light of day in terms of legislation. Budget cuts and travel restrictions resulted in the Association of Wildlife Investigators holding their last meeting. After all, it was just an old boys' club. Or was it? Then the new millennium dawned, and we were all hopeful that the National Environmental Management Act would finally see us taking wildlife criminals by storm in South Africa. The umbrella legislation was passed, and the Protected Areas and Biodiversity Act followed closely. The legislation was so tight that even Granddad couldn't trim his cycle at home without a permit, if anyone checked. The initial discussions around the implementation of this weighty legislation opened many eyes. Deet realized that the minders of the green issues had actually been doing full-on law enforcement for many years, unlike the minders of the blue and brown matters. In turn, the minders of the green issues had their eyes opened wide when it became obvious that a lot of the enforcement which was about to take place with the new legislation was going to be placed squarely on their shoulders. The Green Scorpions raised their tail to sting and looked around for support and saw a lot of familiar faces, very few new faces. After all, the Green Scorpions were a virtual organization. There were no warm bodies in these posts. Same old, and getting older. Since the invention of the wheel, it's been round and it turns. Right. Here I have to ask, have we learned from history? All of our organizations undergo regular restructuring, and the police are no exception. The Endangered Species Unit closed its doors, and not surprisingly, the members were absorbed into other units. Their responsibility was delegated to the provinces. One of the major criticisms leveled at the unit was that they couldn't serve the whole country from one base in Pretoria. More of this later. In KZN, the closure of the Endangered Species Protection Unit at least had one positive spin-off. The SAPS Prosecuting Service and Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife supported the formation of the KZN Wildlife Crime Working Group, established to address all levels of wildlife crime in the province, and through ups and downs, still remains the backbone of our provincial effort in this regard. The start of this millennium was indeed a busy time for us. Around the country, much training was presented to enable the Green Scorpions to take on their powerful duty of becoming environmental management inspectors, responsible for investigations and inspections of all things green, brown, and blue. But I pause to wonder, how many of these newly trained environmental management inspectors have actually taken on the whole wardrobe of clothes of fully fledged investigators? Prosecutors and magistrates learnt that the new legislation was complicated. We've heard about this in the Marine Living Resources Act, replaced something relatively simple with a complex piece of legislation, and that the regulations were indeed holy, that is, full of holes. The law enforcers were battling to understand and enforce the new legislation, and the public were largely ignorant about the legislation, and still are. Or perhaps they were even more confused than the officials, who were also confused. Back to the rhino matters. In 2007, the full impact of well-organized criminal syndicates targeting our rhinos came to the fore, and did we wake up with a bang? Same old didn't work anymore. We tried, but it wasn't getting us where we wanted to go. The positive spin-off from this rhino poaching scourge saw the birth, or is it rebirth, of a national forum for wildlife investigators, the National Biodiversity Investigators Forum. And surprise, surprise, there were a lot of familiar old faces around the same table again. So 10 years into the new millennium, and the Endangered Species Desk of the SAPS was back in existence. And DEA sought to populate the virtual Green Scorpion structure with permanent posts for warm bodies. Both of these initiatives reside in Pretoria to serve the whole country. Remember why the ESPU was closed? The panic continued, and the National Wildlife Crime Reaction Unit was formed under the DEA and driven by Sam Parks. And around the table sat familiar faces. This virtual unit comprises Sandparks officers and seconded officials from other departments and provinces. No new faces or permanent posts. So, from the challenges facing the shared sheriffs and bokwachters of the 80s to those facing the contemporary law enforcement officials of today, what a change. What a change in the complexity of the legislation that we enforce. The much higher professional standard required of the officers when gathering evidence. The worries of being countercharged for wrongful arrest or wearing a target on your back for the criminals supporting multi-billion rand international enterprises, the very same enterprises that the people sitting around the table, the familiar faces sitting around the table, seek to destroy. Have we learned from history? We should surely have realized that the same capacity facing a much greater requirement is not going to give us the advantage we seek. The investigation staff numbers have not increased in any way proportional to the task at hand. Professional investigations take time, and this equates to manpower, experienced manpower, which can mentor others to stand fast in the face of the challenges that we face. Okay, I'll close you off now. Thanks, Graham. In our further deliberations during this symposium, let's consider, no matter how well we guard the fences, if we don't increase our capability in wildlife detectives, the same old faces will soon be gone, and with it the rhinos we love may follow suit, and other species, destroyed by greed for money and disrespect for the earth that we live on. Have we learned from history? I hope so. But let's go further than an academic study of history, the story which I've shared with you. The Oxford Dictionary describes make history as to do something memorable. We can achieve this by considering the need for more wildlife investigators as one of the most single, most efficient, and effective ways of meeting the current challenges facing enforcement and compliance. So let's make history today.